Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Hydrogen Rising. I'm Sandy Safro. I'm Associate General Counsel for Energy and Technology at the Edison Electric Institute. And I am joined today in our virtual recording booth by David Wochner, my consummate co-host, who is a partner at the global law firm K&L Gates. David, it's great to see you.
You too, Sandy. Yeah, for all our listeners out there, we do actually see each other when we're recording these. So, yes, great to see you and excited about our conversation today.
Me too, David. So today we are going to be talking about the COP26 conference, and here to help us break it down is someone who was actually on the ground in Glasgow, Eric Holdsworth. Eric is Managing Director for Clean Energy and Environmental Policy here at the Edison Electric Institute. And I think, Eric, you may have just celebrated a professional milestone. Was it 20 years at EEI?
It is indeed, Sandy. And thanks to you and David for the opportunity to join you all today and talk about the COP.
Well, thanks, Eric. We're really excited to have you here today, too. I know we mentioned this a couple of episodes ago, but as a quick refresh, EEI is the trade association that represents all U.S. investor-owned electric companies. Our members provide electricity for about 220 million Americans. So if you live in the United States, you may get electricity in your home or in your office or in your home office these days through an EEI member. I'm sure, Eric, you're going to talk more about this, but on theme with today, EEI and its member companies are committed to getting the energy that we provide as clean as we can, as fast as we can, and doing that without compromising on reliability or affordability. So before I turn it over to David to start off our conversation with Eric, David and I thought it would be helpful to provide just a little bit of background on the COP26 conference for our listeners, for folks who may not be super familiar. So for those who are not aware, COP is the Conference of the Parties, and it is the decision-making body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, or as we sometimes just call it, which I'll refer to it today as just the convention. The convention entered into force in 1994, and its objective, kind of the overall overarching objective, is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous human-induced interference with the climate system. As we'll be talking more about today, the convention is the parent treaty for the 2015 Paris Agreement, which nearly 200 countries signed. The Paris Agreement itself is aimed at keeping the global average temperature rise this century as close as possible to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So when you hear people talk about keeping 1.5 alive, that's what they're talking about. Now, the COP, or the Conference of the Parties, is generally an annual conference, and the 26th meeting was supposed to be held in 2020, but was postponed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So instead, COP26 was held this year, and actually was held just a couple of weeks ago, as I mentioned, in Glasgow, Scotland. COP26 has been called the most important COP since Paris, which was COP21, and of course, where the Paris Agreement was signed. And the reason for that is that the Paris Agreement required countries to provide increasingly ambitious climate action goals every 5 years. So ahead of COP26, countries were asked to provide their plans for reducing emissions by 2030. The COP26 conference included meetings focused on a number of different areas, including a hydrogen transmission summit. And if you haven't already, I would recommend checking out the recording of that program. You can find it on the UN page for COP26. It's really well done. As we'll touch on today, the parties at COP26 finalized the outstanding portions of what's known as the Paris Rulebook, which is the set of rules that are needed to implement the Paris Agreement. Countries also agreed that at COP27, which will be held next year in Egypt, that they will pledge further reductions to CO2 emissions. There are a number of other items that were agreed to and discussed at COP26, some of which we'll touch on today. But I do want to mention there were several exciting announcements that relate to the role that hydrogen may play in helping countries reach these emissions reductions targets. This includes the announcement of an initiative called H20, which includes 28 companies from around the world in various sectors, including mining, energy, the financial sector, the manufacturing sector. And each of these companies is pledging to take action by 2030 to support hydrogen development in some way, whether it's in terms of supply, demand, providing technical support or financial support. That's a really exciting one and one to watch. Scotland also announced its new H2 action plan or hydrogen action plan. And as we talked about in our last episode here in the United States, Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021, or IIJA, which was signed into law earlier this week. And the COP26 conference was, of course, a significant driver in getting that legislation across the line. So in terms of background, I think we'll leave it there. And David, I will actually turn it over to you to start off our conversation with Eric today.
Thanks, Sandy, and really helpful background, I know, for me and for our listeners, and lots of threads to pull from that. Eric, it's great to be with you. I'm going to kind of say right off the bat that when Sandy and I were talking about having you as a guest on the podcast, I got pretty excited, a little bit of goosebumps. And as the young people these days say, I had a bit of FOMO, or fear of missing out, because I wasn't in Glasgow and was seeing fantastic reports from people who were. So, obviously it probably looked a little bit different than past COPs, given some of the pandemic restrictions still in place. But I think for our listeners, it'd be great to hear what it was like. You were on the ground there, and so would love to hear from you a bit, kind of general impressions, and where do you see the good takeaways from COP26?
Well, thanks, David, and thanks, Sandy. That was great background, and I'm glad you mentioned the Framework Convention, because that is COP26 is just the moniker to a whole series of meetings that go on. And of course, the Paris Agreement has its own body, and that's an important part of this. No, David, I mean, there was a lot of FOMO going on because 40,000 people showed up to do something in Glasgow, 25,000 of which apparently were able to get the magic badge and be able to get into the blue zone. So there was a lot of people came, and I would say that was really one of my first impressions, was really the scale of this thing. And I just don't mean, of course, the number of people, this being the largest since Paris. And you think about that occurring in a COVID pandemic environment, that's kind of mind-boggling. But of course, the footprint, the largest footprint was a mile from end to end. I mean, it took you almost half an hour to get from the entrance to the back of the facility. So the scale, the daily testing, I mean, to me, the enormity of kind of the scale of this whole thing was pretty. Was one of the first things I took away with. I mean, the outer perimeter that never normally occurs at a COP, and having to pass that with your ID and your negative COVID email. Anyhow, just that was kind of mind-boggling. And one of the other big takeaways to me was in what I used to call the sideshow, which is sort of pavilions and side events and people talking about what they're doing. That was the main show for a good chunk of this COP. Now, obviously, at the end, of course, the outcomes are critical, and I'll touch on that in just a minute. But to me, it was interesting both in the fact that that was the first thing you came upon once you got into the facility. And also that's where really for about 10 of the 12 days, most of the activity was, where announcements were being made, where initiatives were being discussed. And frankly, and I heard Jonathan Persian talking about this earlier today, where people were really talking about the doing and what's happening and what's going to happen and the ongoing effort. And so that was, there was a lot of action and excitement there. I would say two other just quick takeaways. To me, general impressions. One was that U.S. leadership on climate was back, and that was in pretty full evidence. So that was great to see, both in its U.S. center, where they were showcasing on a daily basis all the activity going on in the U.S., but into the presence of the cabinet officials and Secretary Kerry and others, and really the U.S. negotiating team, again, playing a key role, like it did in Paris, in helping bring across to the finish line the Glasgow Climate Pact and the agreements there. And then, I guess my last takeaway was just, and I think Sandy captured this, you did as well, the outcome itself, right? The Glasgow Climate Pact, in fact, really did. It's really an important milestone, in part because it comes after it's the 5-year rhythm of Paris that we were talking about and the enhanced contributions. So it sort of solidified that, but it made it real, right? It happened, and people came, and we kept 1.5 alive. And yeah, there's more to be done next year, and that was all a part of the outcome. Is people that didn't really step up need to step up. But there was a lot of focus on 1.5, so that was great. And operationalizing the rule book, I think, was another, for industry, for the power sector, another key outcome. And of course, there were many others, but those are kind of my general, takeaways. It was certainly a COP unlike no other. And I've been to 24 of the 26, so it was truly a spectacle into itself. But I think a really positive one, and excited about talking about some of the outcomes as we go on today.
That's great. That's really helpful, Eric, and really interesting to hear. And David's kind of shaking his head along for our listeners who just get our audio. So you mentioned the accomplishment of keeping 1.5 alive and the finalization of the rule book. And the COP26 president, Alok Sharma, made a comment that I think is really interesting and I think relevant to the question I'm about to ask you. He said, we can now say with credibility that we've kept 1.5 degrees alive, but its pulse is weak and it will only survive if we keep our promises and translate commitments into rapid action. I think that's a pretty strong call to action for the countries that were members of COP26. And so I'm curious what you see on the horizon and how you see the conference and its outcomes informing the next steps that the energy industry may take as we look to reduce emissions globally and also kind of maintain our pretty energy intensive lifestyles.
Well, that's a great question, Sandy, and thanks. And actually, I kind of think it's a two-way street as I reflect on that a little bit, in that, as you may know, in the power industry, a lot of most of the EEI members have adopted their own net zero goals by 2050 or earlier. So there's already, for our industry, I think that is the horizon, right? For the industry, it's net zero by 2050, and that horizon is getting closer every day. That's, I think, where the industry is looking. And so to me, that helps inform both what was happening at the COP and, of course, the role of low carbon and decarbonized electricity and helping the full economy reach net zero. I mean, right, it's an integral part of getting the world to net zero, getting the U.S. to net zero, getting the world to net zero, and getting that spread around the world. So a key part of that, and I think that was one, certainly in our industry, that's where the focus is looking at net zero, and that's consistent not only with these member goals, but you see that, right, it was very consistent with the Glasgow Climate Pact and the language in there on 1.5. Right, certainly getting to net zero by 2050 or earlier is sort of about the bare minimum to be able to do that. But there was also language in there calling for all nations to move rapidly towards low and non-carbon power generation, and to phase out, other sources of electricity, coal and fossil fuels. So I thought there was a lot of, even the use of the words unabated coal, right, was clearly a signal that coal with CCS or fossil with CCS in some places may need to be a tool that's utilized and should be. So to me, a lot of signals coming out of there that that's the pathway the world needs to head. And what's exciting to me, and what was exciting really about being there representing the U.S. electric companies, is that we're already there. We're moving there, right? We're ahead of the curve, and we're trying to bring other people with us. And it was really exciting to go over there and be able to tell that story and realize that, the future that the COP is shaping is also being shaped by us and our story and our actions. And so that was really, I thought, a fascinating dynamic that came out of there, and really very consistent with where we're going and where we need to go. And being able to tell our story with 3 of our CEOs there. I mean, no other industry had more than one, and many had none. We had 3 on the ground and 1 virtual. That was a powerful signal too to a lot of actors about this industry takes it seriously, and then they hear our story and what we're doing and realize that we can help shape the future as much as the future is shaping us, right? Those trends really go together, and exciting to be in the middle of it and exciting to be at the COP and talking about that kind of stuff.
So a couple things you said that struck me, Eric, from, I guess, points of relativity. The first is the 2050 point, and I actually just saw this printed somewhere the other day. We are actually closer now to 2050 than we are to 1990. So for those of us, I mean, Sandy's younger than me, so 1990 may not be that relevant to her, but that's pretty shocking when you think about that, right? In other words, it's not that 2050 is not that far away. I think a lot of people in the United States hear 2050 and they say, oh gosh, that's so far out, why is this such a big deal? The other point of relativity is that 1.5 degrees. And I have always thought that for those in the U.S. who have been fighting this fight and focused on climate and making sure we're taking preventative actions, talking about 1.5 degrees doesn't mean anything to Americans, right? I mean, we don't understand what 1.5 Celsius is. And so I think, at least in terms of, and I think this goes a bit to perhaps the question I'll put to you, this is a deeply political issue in the United States. And now, I guess almost 2 weeks ago, we have the passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. President Biden signed that into law earlier this week. I'd be curious kind of how you see the intersection of what you just experienced in Glasgow at COP26 and what is going to be, an enormous expenditure in the United States in transportation, in infrastructure, in energy, in a way that we certainly hope is going to further our climate goals. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, great question. And, it's funny, but that was probably the bill heard around the world, so to speak. I mean, because
totally.
The passage was like immediately felt in Glasgow. I'm not sure if you could even hear an audible murmur when it occurred. But no, I mean, it was a significant development, and it's a great question because it kind of gets back to what we were just talking about and this interlinkage, right? So the BIF or the IIJI, the infrastructure bill, right, has a lot in there. And this is what was so exciting, I think, to EEI and its members, is why we really worked hard to try to get that bill passed, why we felt that was such an important piece of the entire package, why I thought it was, really quite amazing that they were able to pass that and put aside reconciliation for a separate discussion. But critical, I think, as one of you noted, it was really a pretty key signal to come over to Glasgow and for people to hear. And why? Because, right, there is so much in there, and that's why our industry was excited about it, to help us deploy more of what we currently have, but also to help advance the development of those next generation technologies. And we're involved in an effort, the Carbon Free Technology Initiative, maybe we can touch on that later, and other initiatives, right? Because our industry recognizes, right, like, yes, net zero by 2050 sounds great, and to most people it sounds like whatever, that's way out there. But of course, for our industry, we realize if we don't know by the early 2030s how much of this we can start to deploy and at what scale and how we're going to get there, 2050 is never going to happen, Right. And so if anything, we already feel behind the curve. Like we really need to, there's so much to be done, whether that's on hydrogen. And I know you've had 29 episodes. So, and that's just one fuel, right? But there's carbon capture, there's advanced nuclear, there's a whole suite of things. And all of those can also relate to hydrogen, or many of them. So a lot of work that needs to happen. And that's what's exciting about, the infrastructure bill is it's a huge, what we hope to be a big transformative step. A lot of the work that EEI did through the CFTI initiative was really kind of mirrored in a lot of that. I mean, just talking on another webinar earlier today about the impact of the 45Q and the changes in that alone for helping advance carbon capture and storage, which can help us out with hydrogen and, of course, maybe capturing carbon from fossil plants. So a lot of impact, right, in Glasgow, and I think that's why, and certainly for our industry and why we talked a lot about that and our support for it, because we think that's the critical next step for us getting towards 2050, but it's just one. Right, we're going to have to continue to be moving that ball and advancing it, making sure that that doesn't recede down the road. Right, we really need to keep and ramp up funding even more going forward if we're going to get hydrogen out there and make that feasible, and that obviously becoming a critical part. If we're going to get some of these other technologies out there, or find out which tools are going to work where, because it's not going to be one size fits all, right? We're going to need all of these tools. So again, and then you heard, then you saw things like, the Clean Energy Development Initiative and H2O and some of the initiatives that you guys talked about at the beginning that in part are, to make some of those come to fruition, we're going to need this kind of activity. And so getting that across the finish line, and then hopefully if there's some additional funding and reconciliation that can further boost it, it's an important first step, right, in this next step of this transformative journey. But there's certainly be a lot more work that needs to happen and stuff that's got to continue to move forward and push that through the pipeline and get us from talking about, what it could be to, the incubators and everyone else tying that piece together. So, yeah, but really exciting stuff. And, again, that's why there was a lot of energy. And you heard all these announcements about other technologies. And I'm telling you, like in pavilion land, I mean, it seemed like every technology and everything that could have a pavilion had one. So there was a lot of buzz about that, right? Everything from EVs to what the power sector was doing to what you can do with carbon sequestration to, entire pavilions for industries to talk about individual technologies and steps they're taking. It was mind-boggling, and which is why I said that kind of sideshow was really the main show to me in many ways for the first part of the conference, because that's a huge voice that the world was really hearing in a large scale for the first time at the COP.
Yeah, and the financial sector is going to be a huge driver of that too, right? Those technologies, whether it's private equity, venture capital, but that's where we're, we can't rely on that, but it certainly presents opportunities, technology that is as yet unknown to hopefully further our objectives and our aims under climate. Sandy and I have a colleague who leads our fusion energy practice, and there is some exciting stuff happening in fusion energy right now. I mean, there are some real advancements being made. So, I think none of us know exactly what 2050 is going to look like, and it's kind of like that choose your own adventure book.
If I could just jump in on that, because that's a really good point you made. And one of the other things that was going on, right, is we had a lot of administration officials over there. And we were meeting with DOE and others. And I mean, just to your point, right, there's a whole bunch of different technologies, and you've got an agency that I think really understands what they have at their fingertips and their key role in advancing the president's agenda. You've got power industry that gets what it wants to do. You've got incubators and, entities like Breakthrough. And so I think that was another really exciting dynamic. Yeah, it's like it's time to take advantage of all this, because clearly I think the government recognizes this is kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity potentially. Let's set this stuff on the right track and get it moving forward. I didn't mean to jump in, but you mentioned that, I was like, oh yeah, that was a great point.
Eric, before we wrap up, there is one thread that I want to pull a little bit more on. You mentioned the Carbon Free Technology Initiative, or CFTI, and I think we've also mentioned the Low Carbon Resources Initiative, or LCRI, in past episodes. And I think it'd be interesting for our listeners if you could talk a little bit more about those initiatives, and particularly since we're talking about COP26 today, how those two initiatives sort of interface with some of the commitments that have come out of that conference.
No, thanks. I appreciate that. And so, actually what was exciting is EEI, we did a whole series of events over there, like many other stakeholders, on highlighting our CEOs. And one of them was on this very topic that we're really exploring today, clean energy technology development and its role in helping the U.S., the nation, the world meet net zero goals. And so we talked a lot about our carbon-free technology initiative. This is an initiative that EEI partnered up starting last year with a group of NGOs, the Clean Air Task Force, Third Way Bipartisan Policy Center, other industry groups like Nuclear Energy Institute, think tanks like C2ES and the ITIF, and others, and all with a common mission, right? Focusing on the power sector, identifying a handful of technologies, recognizing you kind of need all the tools, but you can't focus on everything all the time. So we picked what we thought for five really high value added technology areas: hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, advanced nuclear, fusion and fission, renewables, advanced renewables, and then long duration storage. And so through this effort, really trying to look at each of those technology areas and think about what it would take to get those to be at full scale commercial deployability. How long is that roadmap? And then what do you need to do to get it there? And of course, every technology is at different stages, and really fleshed that out. And that became what we did is took those recommendations and boiled them down, and then went up to Capitol Hill and the federal government and worked pretty hard to try to get those turned into legislation. And I think a fair amount of which you did see in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Now, EPRI's low carbon resource initiative is really kind of the other side of this coin, right? So if CFTI is trying to get more money into the system, get detailed recommendations, get DOE to deploy funding to get that moving, LCRI is coming in with companies that want to do demonstration projects and are putting up funding for that to like catch that piece of the spectrum. And then, kind of in the middle, you've got the breakthroughs of the world who are funding incubators, and these small incubators that are actually developing the technologies then that would be coming out of the pipeline and being then ready for some of this deployment in LCRI. So it's really part of what we wanted to talk about at that event, which we did, was both of those initiatives, how they come together and how all of that kind of feeds, a holistic chain of like really trying to, again, recognizing that we have got to get moving, right? We don't have until 2050. We have until 2030 if we want to keep 2050 in range. And so a huge push. And we've been at that now for about a year and a half. And I got to say, it was just an amazing experience to work with so many different groups that don't normally work together. And everyone came together in CFTI on this single focused mission, which is, I think, part of the strength of that effort. And that was, we all recognize that was our step one, right? And that's not a 1-year process. You've got to come back and do it next year and the year after and the year after, or people forget and funding dries up and, great initiatives fall by the wayside. We don't have time for that. We just don't have the time. So we're back at it. We've had some success, but now it's time to go back and look at where are we, what's next, what do we need Congress to do, and again, kind of continue to move that forward. And all of that tying back into then this push for, if you're going to limit temperature rise to 1.5, you've got to get to net zero. A decarbonized power sector is a key element of doing that and spreading that around and getting to transportation and other sectors. And the products that can be derived from that, particularly hydrogen, can play a key role in decarbonizing the rest of the economy. So, and I think there was a recognition you saw a lot of that in the pact, I think, about the urgency, right? Just the need to move with speed on all of this and, recognizing now, and I think what's exciting about Paris is just, game on, right? We've got a rule book. It's time to implement. It's time to go out. People can start developing projects. I mean, that may or may not be as big a deal for our industry, but clearly we need to get out and move on the technology and get that developed, deployed, and out there. So, just a really kind of a large echo chamber in a lot of ways in terms of where we're headed and what needs to happen, and then where Glasgow is taking us, right, and where the next are in the international process is very consistent with where we're headed. And I think we're going to want to be back at COP27 and COP28 and COP29 telling the story and telling how much more progress we've made and really making sure we make that progress. The members are leading, and it's great to see an industry where the CEOs have taken this issue, controversial, thorny issue, by the horns and have a whole vision and are moving towards that. And really exciting and great to go over with them and then be able to tell that story. And it's I would say in many ways, it was a COP like all COPs, and they have their usual rhythm, including the great last minute drama. And, if you're watching the webcast, that was always, kind of a cool moment to catch the drama that doesn't get scripted. Sometimes they have to let it slip out there and everyone gets a chance to watch, and that's rather fun. But it was really different, I think, and I think others have mentioned this. I heard Jonathan mention this today, the scale of civil society, business, environmentalists, youth, everybody involved in that message of action, take action, we're taking action. That was quite different and really pretty amazing.
This was great. Thank you, Eric, for talking us through this. Yeah. I think even though many of us probably did watch the live webcast, now we feel a little bit more like we had our feet on the ground there. So thank you so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. This was really enjoyable, and I can obviously go on for hours and hours about the COP, but appreciated the chance to kind of unpack some of this and share some of that experience with you and your listeners.
Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, as always, also to our listeners. You can find this and our past episodes of Hydrogen Rising at klgates.com/hydrogen or on your favorite podcast app. I've had several conversations actually in just the past week or so with folks whose companies are getting involved with hydrogen, and they're starting to look for resources where they can learn in. If you find yourself in that position, I would strongly recommend taking a look at K&L Gates Hydrogen Handbook. It is a truly substantive document. I don't know, David, what is it coming in at these days? 300 pages more?
I think we're close to 400 pages now.
Oh my gosh.
Given all the global jurisdictions that we cover.
Well, that's great. That you can find that resource on the K&L Gates website as well. It's available at klgates.com/hydrogen. If you have questions about anything that we talked about today, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or to David or to Eric. And we will be back with a new episode in just 2 weeks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.